where so Bridgend Farmers Mutual, as the name suggests, we're about the farmers and working cooperatively. So what we're trying to do is different to what you might experience with experts coming in saying, here's a national park and a state forest, let's draw a straight line between those and call that a biodiversity corridor. Instead, what we want to know is how does it work on each farmer's property, and how do we build up, whether it's crooked and dog-legged all over the place, stepping stones that enable that extension of habitat that work for the individual farmer, but are coordinated so that you can actually achieve that habitat extension and, as a result, encourage the sort of endangered species that we have here on the Trap Rock, so that they've got a home and so that they've got some resilience to that home. One of the things that we've found is that the current mechanisms for biodiversity, for example, are at a farm by farm level and create islands of biodiversity, which don't lead to that extension of habitat and resilience of environment and long-term security for those species that we're ultimately trying to protect from going extinct, right? And so we need to be aware that this is a different paradigm that we're working with when you're coming from individual farm up and trying to coordinate those activities. And we're deliberately using the word stepping stone as opposed to corridor or biolink, because even though the 8 farmers that are involved with this project represent about 18,000 hectares, and we might be looking at about 450 hectares or about 5% of their land massive contribution into this shared project. If they were to work under the existing biodiversity mechanisms, that 5% of each farm that's uncoordinated would have far less impact than the 5% of farm that's coordinated and mapped to the other things that each farm on their own requires. So that's a little bit about the methodology. I'll return to talk about how we do the landscape scale stuff and how we scale that beyond this initial group of 8 farmers. But I'm going to hand over to you, Kim, if you're ready, and we will do a quick deep dive into each individual farm and what happened there. Got your slides to go, Kim?
So anybody got any questions for audio on the methodology? Is that clear? Cool.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Whilst that's powering up, there was one major point I forgot to make. Along with bringing the farmers from the ground up individually, making sense on in their own context and collectively, we also need to bring those groups that the farmers work with, their supply chains, their finance, WWF, etc., along for the journey as well. So today is our second meeting and the first time we've been able to bring those people together.
Okay, so my little talk's very short. Basically, we've got the Trap Rock Landscape Biodiversity and Regenerative Project, which we've been talking about here today. And we have a look there. There's some of the species that we're aiming to protect. If we can go to the next slide for me, please. No,
Page down.
no. Technical, probably.
Maybe start with what you did on those funds.
Yeah, so in the process of working with the farmers, we've done a digital representation of their properties. Which mapped all their natural capital assets, including their boundaries and various other bits and pieces. So as part of that, we had a look at each farmer's individual carbon footprint. We had a look at the biodiversity that could potentially be around their properties. And we also had a look at the regulated vegetation maps by Queensland Globe and with another partner in the Region Farmers Mutual. The resulting information that came out of that has been delivered to each farmer, except for one, in the terms of a 20-page report. So it's fully documented out, and that gives you a really good picture of where you sit in terms of your carbon neutrality, where you need to get to, and some opportunities and potentials for that. No, not going to go. Bizarre.
Those reports, by the way, finalised and each farmer's batch.
So it looks like the slideshow isn't going to work, so I'm just going to talk to it, right? We can try to get into the take too long to figure it out. So what I was going to showcase for you is one particular landholder's property. Unfortunately, the pieces are not working, so we'll just talk to it. So Andy Ferrier had an idea that he might have some boxgum grassy woodland ecosystem on his property. And so in conjunction with SQL's mapping expert, Mick Petter, who's on the call, we got some overlays of the regulated vegetation maps into Andy's digital twin. And then Andy went out and mapped what he thought might be boxgum grassy woodland ecosystem around that. And what it clearly showed was that there was an area in the centre of the block that was regulated vegetation under the state legislation, and around the outside of that was all of this potential ecosystem. So we then came up with a really quick methodology and sent Andy out with his camera and his GPS and sent that over to Greg to have a look at some of those images and just to give us a bit of a sense of what we were talking about. So if Greg's happy to answer the question what he found when he looked at Andy's twin, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I can't remember, I probably got it on that laptop there, or fire up and right directly, but I think there was, so Andy, we basically talk about boxgum grassy woodlands in terms of with trees and without trees, because under the way it's classified under the EPBC Act is it's boxgum grassy woodland and Yeah, much less regen or trees. Yes, it'd be pretty good. But the next step is to actually do a more physical on-ground assessment to say, well, this actually ticks the box of, you know, abundant regenerating canopy species of the five critical tree species. Or it has, I think the threshold is 20 trees per hectare of mature trees of the ones that define woodland, which is white box, yellow box, white box, red, yellow, two grey boxes, eastern grey box and western grey box. And all of those things, well, the further west you go in the trap block, you get into the western grey box. Most of the stuff close to Stanford is all the Molly-Canna, eastern grey box. But yes, I mean, in this region, that grey box actually forms part of the white box, yellow box community. It's actually one of the defining species. So, whereas further south, you're limited to white box, yellow box, and red guys, defining woodland trees, defining the community. So we're kind of a little bit of a trick up our sleeve in terms of those extra species we can chip into the community description.
But the other point where there is a matter of regeneration, the natural regeneration, and that's really hard to pick up from satellite.
Yeah.
Now there's some thousands of little seedlings like that.
Yeah.
Naturally.
Yeah, so in terms of going back to the stuff that we've asked Tanya about, like there's, and just from my quick ride around the other day, there's a lot of young regrowth in the country. You know, like it would be a hell of a lot cheaper to turn that into dry habitat and go out and plant a couple 100,000 trees.
Is it less than 2 years tall?
A lot, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's, you know, like it's only knee high. Yeah.
So Greg,
A lot of that, like you can see that from the patchiness on the cancer and the satin. I actually went through a bunch of historical imagery on Google Earth to try and get a bit of a picture of what it looked like when it's really dry and what it looks like when it's green as well. And you can actually see a lot of that regen. So there's good mixed age regen. That's the other important thing about sort of the biodiversity value of the community. The mixed age regen is a much more dynamic system that's actually providing long-term habitat values that can relatively easily be managed into that community as well. So
The bypass, odd one out, this whole trap up area has got a lot of hospitals. Sorry, sheep, all that.
I guess that's one thing to consider, isn't it, in this, because we've had a good rainfall, that we start regenerating that before it gets more into we're thinking about doing the carbon project more than registered before it gets more into this. Otherwise, you miss the boat.
Any questions to me? Otherwise, I'm going to hand over to Wardy.
do people understand basically the digital twin and what we're talking about in terms of that tool? People are clear on that now? Yep. Cool.
Sorry, we did have images.
Pretty pictures aside, we're actually starting to tell a pretty interesting story here already. And what I wanted to do is look at, I've got the capacity on screen. If you'll bear with me, I'm going to share screen so that the folks online can see. This is the, oh, we've got a bit of a, there we go. No, I'm still mute. There we go.
As you can see, Andrew, I was breaking your digital twin with our SQL one.
I can't hear anymore. Wardy, are you on mute?
That's because if I don't put myself on mute, I get feedback. Okay.
Julie.
Am I going to get feedback? Yes. Yes.
You can turn off, yeah, there you go, we're good.
Okay. Each farmer has their own unique digital twin. That's not going to work.
Mhm.
Emissions balance.
That's good. Uh,
Is as we move across from an individual farm view to a track rock wide view, I'm still on mute, so I don't know why it's 30. There we go.
You might not turn your computer speaker on.
That's it.
It's good now for us on the line.
It's good for you?
Yeah.
All right, I can live with this little bit of reverb,
Yeah.
I reckon. All right, so SQL has each of the digital twins for our 8 farmers. The boundary and the suitable habitat areas are mapped. And what we also have is the Sundown and Girraween parks. And what we've been able to identify from that is a couple of clusters. There's a cluster of 4 farms around the Cement Mills region and a cluster of farms around the Pikes Creek region. Now, each of those farms have similar carbon and regenerative opportunities, because most of them are in sheep, some are in cattle, some have got a little bit of horticulture. However, there are things that separate them. So the best carbon opportunities exist up at the Cement Mills area, and the best habitat extension area opportunities are closer to Pikes Creek, because it's closer to Sundown National Park. So you're able to get with that first stepping stone out of the national park into private hands, farmers' hands. And those farmers, instead of locking it up, are able to be encouraged to actively manage that area. So if you will join me, we're going to do a bit of co-design. And the first thing that we want to kind of work out with ourselves around the table, and we've got some of the farmers online. Rick, you're going to be my Adriana Examinees, please. We're going to document what are the outcomes in stepping stone 1 around Pikes Creek. They'll be fairly similar to the ones around Cement Mills, but what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve? Now, outcomes is a pretty wanky word. So what are the results that we want to get? We want to get koalas, quolls, region honeyeaters, swift parrots off that extinction radar, right? And we want to give them a robust and resilient habitat. So that's an example of an outcome. But it's not just the outcomes for individual species that we need to look at. We need to be building this from the farmer's perspective up. So if I walk around the room, Andy, I'm going to throw to you first. Other outcomes aside from habitat for swift parrots, quolls, koalas, etc. What's something that you're trying to achieve?
I'd like to achieve off-farm income for land that's locked up for the greater good, or managed for the greater good, if you do well for it. And that greater good is basically to enhance the biodiversity outcomes of biodiversity, but I'm really interested in overcarbon. Yeah, so that's to manage my company better, get remunerated for that. You know,
Brilliant outcome. Donna,
There's not a lot we can really add to Andy, really, is that, you know, we want to increase the biodiversity and on the whole of the farm, not just the stewardship that we already have. So we only got 140 hectares, but we like to increase the biodiversity across the whole of the farm. And by increasing the plant biodiversity, hopefully the wildlife will come.
and Peter, I'll come back to you, Donna, with a thought that popped up, but Peter, while we're there.
Yep,
And
I
how
think trying to manage the land as well as continue farming and still trying to increase biodiversity as well as you maintain your farming side of it, I think is a very important part as well.
and abundance like that, food doesn't make us very well, it doesn't. To be a regen farmer, we need to have an economic and an environmental profit, and one without the other is either mining for ecological capital or it's conservation as opposed to regenerative agriculture. So for our definition of regenerative agriculture, it's economic and environmental profit. And Donna, one of the things that for those that aren't aware, you've been for the last 20 years under a box gum.
It's 14.
14.
Yes.
Would you mind sharing with everybody here, not just the outcomes that, well, firstly, what outcome has been achieved for you with that conservation agreement up till now?
Well, there's one of the things is that the Queensland area come and do audits, and so we've got actual data to back up the regeneration of what it was and what it now is. And also how, after 3 years of worst drought record, how does the land actually bounce back? And just to, some of you may have already heard this, so I apologise for repeating myself, but the audit from March 2019, so 3 years after a drought, the Queensland Area came and do an audit on a 20 metre by 20 metre site within the Crescent Box Woodland Sanctuary. Within that site area, they could only identify at that point 6 native species. However, the following year, they came back, same time of year, when we had 300 mils of rain in January and February, a total across those months. So we weren't down to drought, but we had a decent rainfall. And in that same 20 metre by 20 metre area, there were 59 native species, of which 20 were native grasses, and the rest herbs and boards and different bushes. So it just shows that given the opportunity, the land can bounce back, and that's the real positive that we've got living here in the Trap Rock and doing these projects, is that the land, given a chance, will come back if it's managed in a good way.
Feels like an opportune time to not just look at the outcomes, but also what are the management actions that a farmer like yourself or like Andy or Pete or the others that are online, what are the actions that you feel are a prerequisite to get those outcomes?
Well, the main thing about it is that we're still allowed to graze every winter. So after the seed is set and, you know, and to bring the biomass down, is that you're allowed to graze from the 1st of March until the end of August. So you can work in whatever the grazing if you so wish. There's also periodically, when the biomass is increased, because you've had a rain event, let's say, is that you can go in and do some short-term summer grazing to bring that biomass down as well. So in terms of everything else, you have to leave bush rocks where they are, fallen timber where it is dead trees standing, because that provides habitat for all the different species in that way. And obviously remove any exotic species as and when they occur. Obviously, we're not going to totally eradicate them, and that's not the expectation, but just to keep them controlled in that way. And so what I'm trying to say with that is that it doesn't exclude you from farming, but you wouldn't be able, as a farmer, to have the same system running all at the same time. But what you could do is maybe manage it in such a way that within stepping stones, you could get those a bit wider, and then you could maybe do more rotation on grazing.
It sounds like a very smart management technique regardless, instead of set stocking and you've got a plan to graze, so you're going to plan when those stock are in those areas and plan when they're not. The requirement for most habitat, definition is a fence, and a lot of government wants to put a fence around because they're tracking hectares under active management. But the outcome you mentioned before was that improvement of biodiversity value over time, not necessarily the amount of hectares. How important has the provisioning of fencing, or how compulsory was fencing for your?
Well, I have to say that the initial fence, we bought our farm 6 years ago, so we did not implement the stewardship project in the first place. But the original fence that was put up in place was not an exclusion fence. It's only in the last couple of years that we've been in a position to bring up the fence up there and really control the macro incursion and grazing the area. So even with that in place or not in place, we're still showing a huge improvement in terms of biodiversity and the remnant vegetation. So that's, if that answers your question.
It absolutely does. So in terms of
Sorry, this briefly mentioned fencing. We've got a lot of exclusion fencing running through these areas that you've got this project running over. So how does that affect what you're doing as far as trying to link properties up? You're thinking of putting some sort of access points along fences to let things through, or maybe the things you're working with are able to get through?
Yeah, so as in, we don't have preference, and we are discovering today whether there's a value in a 5-wire fence versus ring lock exclusion fence, because there's definitely a cost difference. And if we're going to incentivize farmers to put up a fence, we have to know the value proposition for each fence type. So, as in, we aren't telling anybody which fence they need to put up. Each farmer needs to be able to kind of work out, well, does the additional pressure from those kangaroos having continuous access to grazing that, even though I've taken the sheep or the cattle off that country, if that kangaroo pressure is going to reduce the regeneration, and the incentive is sufficient enough for me to make an exclusion fence, then it might add up. But if it's not going to add up, there might not be enough incentive for a farmer to fence that area. So it's an open question, is my response. And we're not dictating it, we're just trying to understand the terms.
I think part of the question, if I'm wrong, please speak for me, is that there is already exclusion fences in place, such as the dog fence.
Yeah.
And having a biodiversity stepping stone that comes over that would be an issue.
Yeah, that's what I was coming from.
Yeah.
You're trying to link these corridors. How things are going to move around. So, I mean, they're a necessity for us to have the expensive, but how you expect things to, having access points to make things work.
Cool, and
To answer your question, feathers, I don't know if you can hear or not, but these are addressed as part of all the feathers, they'll fly on the top, that's not a worry. The ball they can fly and they can go through, it's the teddies, it's make it call it the flowers. And there's a kid. Okay, kids. And you can build styles and then the pressure points, if you know where they're traveling through the landscape, you can build styles to.
Yeah, like a little box
Just
section.
nothing over, and nothing else on that, yeah. So that's, yeah.
I was just gonna make a comment from a broader ecological perspective, I guess, with regard to excluded fencing. How this, the process of improving management and biodiversity at the farm level may play into that. Excluded fencing, it can create barriers, which is what you're acknowledging, and so we need to have crossing points. The flip side of that is that if you're managing within that exclusion fence boundary or on different sides of the boundary, you're changing your management of the country and getting an improved biodiversity condition of the landscape, and wildlife in that part of the landscape may not have to move outside the fence to find the resources it needs. So there's kind of a plus from that side as well. So you want, so yes, there's potential crossing points for koalas or echidnas or whatever. I don't know how that you make a echidna climb over a dog fence, but I think the other way of thinking about it is if you're talking about the objectives that were listed up there first about improving the biodiversity outcomes at farm level. If you're improving biodiversity condition, getting the increased number of plant species, that's supporting, and so that's making that landscape more resilient from a biodiversity conservation perspective. So critters that might have 20 years ago and moved long distance across the country, if you're now changing the management of the country so that the country is retaining more habitat value for the wildlife, they don't have to move across those fences.
And they don't have the predator.
And so I guess I wrote, or Holly and I and others wrote the monitoring plan for the exclusion fences for the Southern Downs Regional Council. We were really hoping to get some good research outcomes on the effect that these fences do have on biodiversity. So there's another opportunity in this whole process. If you're monitoring stuff at a farm level, trying to look at what's happening with your biodiversity, there's a real opportunity there to say, look, we've excluded the dogs, we're getting, we've managed the rabbits or we've done whatever. We're getting all these biodiversity benefits because the fences are there. So the fences aren't necessary, because as purely as an ecologist, when I started seeing these fences go around the landscape, I was horrified. And I used to end to an extent for large mobile stuff, ground-based stuff that has to move long distance. But I think what I've just done, I've taken that out with another one on and said, look, we can maybe do this different way, we can think about it different ways. We can ecologically, we can still have that functionality in the landscape.
Yeah, but Andrew's right, most of the animals you're talking about will have access anyway.
Yeah,
Through, I mean, the money they go probably four squares high, they can get through.
Yeah.
Then you're talking about like holes and.
Yeah, I think, maybe that's, where you, if you do want to make a difference, that's, maybe that's, you can tap into some of that funding that's available, what we've been talking about from CDA about, making things better for biodiversity, those events.
Yeah.
Koala and stuff.
But it's not sending you individual pockets that are fully fenced certain. It's not a big custom anyway. So, if we're talking about big losses,
There's all sorts of things. Yeah, there's lots and lots of opportunities that you can tie a whole bunch of, things together with what you're trying to achieve with RFM. What those fences are about.
Well, I just want to talk to a level of confidence with you, Greg. The value of a ring lock fence versus single plain wire fence. and that research that you wanted to do, you know, how much would it cost you to get to 80% confidence on that versus 95% confidence? And I'm gonna have a follow-up question, as you can
That's
imagine.
a how long's a piece of string question, Walkie. Yeah, I know, it just, I mean, we really, what we're trying to do with, or kind of proposing with the dog fence, the cluster fencing, was about trying to monitor those big mobile critters, trying to monitor movement along fences or at edge points in fences.
Yeah.
And so that was a relatively cheap exercise using trail cameras for example. I guess the taking the dogs out of the landscape, what effect does that have on cat and fox populations, and therefore what knock-on effects does that have on small native members? That's a pretty big research question, and so that's a couple of PhD projects in that kind of research. So that's a very expensive exercise to get in that to try and demonstrate that from a wildlife perspective.
Well, let's bring it out of fences, which is still a subject to be negotiated, and into the box gum grassy woodlands and native grasses returning, like the precondition area. To give yourself 80% confidence that an ecosystem is that ecosystem versus moving up to that 95% confidence. So can you give us a price indicator on that?
Well, you're talking landscape at a farm level.
Per farm?
Yeah, so look, what I did for Andy's property, that kind of level desktop assessment, you know, that was, and this is regardless of the day that I spent down here just driving around, having a bit of a look, trying to get my head back in the box going grassy woodland space. With that exercise for Andy, with him providing photos, me pouring over some historic aerial imagery, you know, fiddling around with Andy's digital twin, you know, that was a day's work for me, I would say, and that's your 80% confidence for me. It's another whole day at least of my time to go out over that property probably and do a detailed assessment. If you're talking about using the
By condition report or something?
yes, I use the bio condition method, which is the accepted one for the land restoration fund, or it's the land restoration fund method. If I was to use that or apply that to all those box gum polygon bandies, that's essentially a day's work for me. So it's double what it's cost me so far, what it cost Andy so far, or the program so far to do that. Do that across. So there's a couple of ways of approaching that. One is to say, well, you know, Andy can do a bit more self-assessment. To classify your landscape as box gum grassy woodland, you need several things. If it's woodland, you need to know that you need to know what tree species there, which is relatively straightforward. You need to know whether they're regenerating. You need to have a count of number of mature trees per hectare, and that's reasonably easy to do by water. From the grassy understory, which is where the woodlands have to be grassy, they can't be predominantly shrubby. The key defining characteristic of the woodland of the community, the BGGW community, is that it's native tussock grassland with at least 12 non-grass native species in it, right? So Donna's block going from half a dozen, but before, when they could only find half a dozen native species in that 20-metre plot, it wouldn't have, under the rules, like under the woodland trees rules, if that was just the grassland, you couldn't say that was the derived native grassland. Now we have 59 in there, so after good season, it's really easy to find a whole crap load of native species to look at. Right. And so some of that's self-accessible. Like you don't have to know what those species are. If you can see that if you can take photos of 12, at least 12 different native species in there, a lot of it's really, it's Like I can get to 90% confidence on you doing that level of self-assessment. You've got to also have time to go and do that. And that'll be, walk 100-metre transact. Like make a note of, take a photo of every different little native thing that you see, or hopefully native. Send them on, assess them, so, there's not a lot of time to do that. Then to do that, kind of go to the level where you're looking for using accreditation method like fire commission, or the management department, and on the end is half a dozen polygons. That's I do well get 4 sites. I can probably do 6 sites in a day, so 6 plots. So I for probably the size of Andy's in be a day's work. But you guys, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, some people are going to be a little bit more. You might have done some pasture monitoring in the past, so you have a bit of hand what's out there. So it will be up to you, I guess, to determine where you feel your level of knowledge and expertise and willingness to do this goes. So much in the self-assessment, and I think the way that those accreditation schemes work, or that particular one, the land restoration fund bench method is accepted as an accredited method. It's you hit self-assessment gives you 80%, and then using the method, an expert using the method is gets you 95% confidence, and that's where the dollars start flowing.
And it's a factor of 2x at least on Andy's, but it could be more depending.
Yes, and like obviously the economies of scale too. Like I'm not going to go at the same level of intensity that I might do on Andy's, I might do on Pete's. Much bigger block of dirt, they'll play around with. You wouldn't, like if you do that method to the T, that would be a whole lot of sites on Peter's box. That'll be a lot of sites. You could do a fair bit of it and then like self-assess and then do the detailed order on a small percentage of it. Right, you can probably hit your 95% doing a area order.
Right, so that confidence level comes with a cost.
Yeah.
Go back to Andy's conversation about, I want to be, as an outcome, rewarded for my time that's creating a public asset, creating that biodiversity, habitat for key species and resilience for our communities. So do you have a figure on your opportunity cost? Is it a per hectare figure? Is it a per day figure that you would have to spend to do that MPO?
To me, that is probably a spur in the ones that are going in the initial assessment of photos would be like per hour.
Yeah.
The other one, the other cost, an opportunity cost, but other costs, like you said, if you go forward to do fencing, $6 grand a kilometre at least, off, you have to put a new watering points with a couple of $1,000 for the dam. Then you're changing your stock regime, stock numbers, management plan all around that. So there's all sorts of costs involved in that. If the MBR costs come back on the table, that could be a little set project as well. So you'd have to go right through a whole plan process to analyse all that.
But if we add it up, there's capital costs, there's establishment costs, for the fences and for the baseline.
Quite considerable. The other one is definitely management of it is the pests, weeds, the fire management, and that's an annual cost as well. It's over there, I have to burn this, so you'll manage it for sure.
Just on the topic of costs, so I was listening to you saying 2 days is your time to go out and you look at the stuff online and then go on the ground and get a better assessment, especially with the LRX and the criteria we have to meet. I wasn't sure if you as a group were aware of our carbon funding.
Thank you. I tend to mumble into the table, so thanks for that. I was wondering if you were aware that we have the carbon funding device rebate up to $10,000 to exactly provide, if you are looking at a carbon project or a natural capital-ish LRF project, you can claim up to $10,000 for those costs of having
someone come and do that. I wasn't sure if that was something you were aware of.
It's good to know.
Essentially, yes, yeah. So it's not available at the moment. We've done the rebate a couple of times, so it ran for 7 months in 2020, and I think it ran for 6 or 7 months over 21, 22. Finger in the wind, I reckon it would be available again first quarter or first half of 2023. You've got to get advice from specifically approved advisors who have been approved by the Land Restoration Fund. Pretty easy to become that advisor. Yeah, it's easy enough to become approved. Yeah, when it becomes available, it is a good way to wipe 10 grand off your out-of-pocket expenses or some of this sort of advice. If it's not super urgent to get, it's worth waiting and figuring out exactly what you want. When the rebate becomes available, you can jump on it.
And particularly like you're saying, 80% of self-assessments, if you've done that and you just really go, right, I really want to know about this, I really want to check in. This is what I think it is, then that's going to be really good bang for your buck. The other thing to think about, particularly within the context of this project, is you can also spend it on legal advice. You can spend it on accounting. So if you kind of like, how does this work with a business plan? I don't know how this stacks up. So if you're looking at, you know, CBAs, funding or whatever, you're like, okay, does this meet their criteria? How does that work with carbon funding credits? I think that's something that we don't sell enough when we tell people about the program, is that it's not just for ecology, it's also for assessing, you know, all those costs that go into coming up with some kind of project.
So if we don't set that's 10 grand per farm, does that obligate us to the ongoing benefit of carbon? Does it obligate us to sell through the LRF?
Absolutely not. So the LRF is kind of mandated to do two things. One is, you know, buy projects that have carbon plus co-benefits, which is why we exist. But the other thing that Tom and I mostly do is build capacity for landholders such as yourselves to understand what carbon farming is, to assess their properties for potential. So that meets our ends, whether you go for the LRF or want to do something else entirely.
And something that may not be possible for some of these farmers, like there's two that I'm thinking of that we did twins for, who don't really have carbon opportunities that we've been able to identify. You said natural capital opportunities, so something like fencing and
I guess, like, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but because we do co-benefits, we also want to, you know, as part of CFAR, we want to know that if you want to get assessed for co-benefits such as, you know, threatened vegetation and all those types of things, that's part of the CFAR program. But if it turns out that you don't have enough space or whatever to generate a carbon project, then you've still got that information. And if you want to do, you know, explore other avenues for that particular type of information, then that's also a good thing. But it just, you know, it has to involve the carbon element because it's obviously that name of the program. But because we support, you know, Land Restoration Fund, all the co-benefits that come with that, it gives you a bit more room to figure that stuff out.
Thank you very much. And Donna, were you about to say something? Otherwise, I was going to enter the round before we run out.
The only thing I was going to ask is that if a landowner currently has a carbon project with another company per se, another company, and we do inspire others to program over the top, is that a possibility, or will that, if somebody's already got a carbon project in place, what happens then?
We haven't thought it through. It would be worse the other way around. So the requirement for a carbon opportunity is that it's additional. So you want to have additionality guaranteed when you're going into the carbon project. So if it's already established, then the biodiversity work can probably go on top without suffering. But if you establish biodiversity work and then you try and get that same area with the carbon, unless there's an additional management action that you can attach to that, you might actually be precluded from entering into a carbon project on that basis. It will be context specific. Right?
Kind of depending on the stage of the project. If you've registered the project, that's fine. But if you pull the salt to carbon, then the idea of potential co-benefits, that's sort of moved on because you've already effectively contract to sell the car to someone else.
But if you just registered with the area as opposed to sold, you haven't.
Sorry, say that again.
There's a difference between, so when you register your project with the ERM, you're registering, so to Tony's point, you want to register your carbon project for the trees get to 2 metres high. Because then you've got this baseline recognised and showing change over time. And so that's creating, that's allowing you to create activities. But in terms of the biodiversity, if you're wanting to attract biodiversity as a co-benefit to a carbon project, when you need to be selling the co-benefit at the same time as you're selling the activity, you can't. Currently, there isn't really a market that's, you know, for biodiversity as opposed to the carbon relying.
Yes,
So,
it's more of, yeah, it's biodiversity an additional function of,
And if you sold the carbon, you can't then attach the biodiversity. So if you've registered carbon at the time of registration, attach the biodiversity.
Most landholders wouldn't have sold all their carbon if they've registered in the last 5 years, so they'll still have the option.
sure, there's.
No, that's
So
it.
what do you mean by registering the ERA? What does that?
Well, currently, that's how you do a carbon project in Australia, is you register it with the Commonwealth. And that's how you can then be paid.
Yeah, right, that's the accreditation, that's right, okay, it's just that it needs to be the carbon.
so it's Australian, like 90% of all carbon sport
Sure,
through this, you know, through the so
yes,
the active market is kind of fundamentally built in block.
yes, yeah, I'm with that, I understand that process, sometimes it's just the other language that runs over above it, you know, it's just.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's the 2 metres thing. Is that because you've got to establish some sort of benchmark for this certain level?
Yeah, there's the concept of additionality.
Set apart.
And so it's changed over time. You're sequestering carbon over time, and you're getting rewarded with that sequestering that carbon. And if you've already got your trees established and they're, you know, above 2 metres, well, you've already captured that carbon. And that isn't viewed. There isn't a methodology that says I'm growing trees, but they're already at this height.
They sequester, the trees sequester most carbon as they grow while they're young, or is it?
It's at its simplest, it's the rules of the, if you just think of it, it's the rule that says above 2 metres, the tree exists. We're not going to credit you for any carbon that tree continues to sequester over time.
There's a lot of sort of people that just walk them in
Well,
and re-going,
There
This
is
is what-
5 year.
this is what's going to happen.
If when they're in the register project, the CER will look at what clearing has taken place up to 5 years. If there's clearing taking place, you can't register the project. So if you cleared 5 years previously, that's okay. So there is a 5-year rule there to try and mitigate against that kind of information.
That's what it's going to create. It's going to create. Oh, used on.
It is a very-
Used on, I'm going to pay on this.
That's why the biodiversity is like more interesting.
Are you talking about, because there's a few different methodologies, there's standing carbon before volumes clearance. Is that the same methodology that you're referring to, or are you referring to human reduced replanting clearance?
Well, the 5-year rule, I think, is for both planting and communities. I'm not sure about that. I'm going to
We will have, there is in your report, a great deal of information on the carbon and the rules for each of the methods. I encourage us to come back to it. These two folk have to be out here at 4:15, and we probably want to get to the bit where we talk about how to fund the financial consideration for the actions and the outcomes. And then we can come back, assuming there's more time, we can come back and discuss the carbon methodologies and definitely. Pete, you're right, we're setting up a dysfunctional market where we're encouraging farmers to take out the trees and regrow them.
And that's part of what we want to talk about. Should we?
So I reckon,
She's great.
yeah, I reckon the internet to someone stay and try from people, otherwise it'll just shut it down again.
That's fine. I can't share screens. So I'll have to share screen.
I'll stop sharing. And I'm going to stop recording.